Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 1, Chapter 2, The Primacy of Perception and the Propagation of Praxis. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny and Ryan On. Hello, Pat. Hello, Ryan.
Hey, Jason.
Hello.
My first question, can you outline the thesis behind the primacy of perception?
Yeah, so the thesis written in this chapter is basically that firsthand knowledge, things that you experience, help to shape your perception of any practice or anything in the world. And then that perception, which propagates your preferences, is Darwinian. So, as you go through life, right, your surroundings, everything within your environment is going to enculture you. And you will develop preferences and you will find preferences that you think are better than what you currently have over time, or you'll be exposed to other ideas, which you will then take on, right? Replacing past preferences, maybe getting rid of, preferences that no longer serve you. And as that applies to a practice, right, you might be picking up techniques or techne, right, that are better than old ones, leaving behind poor techne. And this goes on over time as you develop your way within the praxis. And within the chapter, you go on to outline how we've seen this in the art world, right? How preferences change over time. And you make some parallels as well between the art world, right, and the tea world, and how, there's an importance that preferences change over time. Because if nothing is changing, right, then it's the art, right, or the culture surrounding it is slowly dying out, right? So the idea you posit here really is that tea ceremony, right, is living art because preferences change over time, and we want it to stay that way. We don't want it to die.
You said something there about praxes, preferences and praxes being Darwinian. Do you want to expand on that, or Ryan, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, so any Darwinian process is going to have, a fitness function that calls certain things or that gives certain things, other things an advantage. So I think one that you mentioned is sort of contemporary tastes or aesthetic values, which can lead to people picking that up. It was one big takeaway that I had. And as that's also one of the forces that you mentioned too, that change with the times as well. So those aesthetic values, as they change in other arts or other parts of society, they can influence any practice and allow it to evolve with times, where it's picking up key things in the same dynamic sense as other arts.
What are the evolutionary pressures that are shaping today's tea praxis?
I think that goes back to primacy of perception. So it's the way that modern practitioners experience tea ceremony. So you have people that experience it together in groups and communities. Online, you have a lot of hermits that we've talked about before, which experience it alone or more tangentially through connecting with other people only offline, but not having shared sensory experiences in the way that the ceremony has been experienced forever.
I can tag on here too. I think two of the pressures that I really see as I look at kind of the landscape of Chinese tea ceremony is, modernization or a drive to modernize, and then tradition. And you have a lot of people that will, argue that there's no traditional way or no specific tradition of Chinese tea ceremony, that it's a modern practice, right? That's evolved in the past couple hundred years. You have people who are, I think, more within the mindset that we have, that it is a practice whose goals harken back, to approximately the Tang Dynasty, and that as a living art, it has modernized when, just as Ryan mentioned before, right? It's a Darwinian practice. So as better ways to prepare the tea within the spirit of the practice came forward, those were adopted as they were seen fit. And so I think there's always been that kind of clash between pressures to remain traditional or pressures towards modernization within the praxis.
The lack of a top-down institution too makes it all a little fuzzy. What is traditional? When you use a Winchung Bay, that's a relatively modern invention, like they're doing in Taiwan, and to what degree that is progressing the praxis or may or may not be traditional is an interesting thought. And it's actually really, it's hard to untangle those two concepts with the lack of a top-down institution like we see in Japanese tea ceremony.
Yeah, I think the adaptation, right, of some techne versus others is another interesting one too. And just as that applies to wares, right? So using or not using a Wenxiangbei depending on what tea you're brewing or what style of brewing you practice mostly. Another one for me, and that's called out in this chapter, is rinsing. So rinsing your teas before the first brew. Really common and heavily propagated, I would say, in the Western tea community. But, I think it's often thought of as traditional. And I don't have, the history to quite cite it, just talking here on the podcast. But I know we've heard from some former teachers that it's something that really came about in the 80s as pesticides were becoming common, especially in like the Anxi area, right? As pesticides became more prevalent, you have people who thought, all right, let's, rinse the first brew of the tea, right? To get rid of a little bit of whatever was left on the leaves from the farming process. And then over time, you've kind of heard people change their stance on it. Oh, it's to awaken the tea, to get the tea ready for being brewed. Is there, any tradition behind that practice? So I think there's an interesting lens we can put on a lot of different technique, right? And if we look at them as historical or modern, adaptations to the practice, I think that could be a really interesting lens to look at a lot of the ways that we brew through.
One of the things that we're seeing is with the rise of the internet and internet culture. At first, the internet was predominantly text-based, and there was an explosion in the creation of literary content by individuals who previously didn't have a platform or a means of distribution. So previously you had book authors, but then suddenly you had bloggers, right? And before that, there was many complaints about the world being a visual-driven culture with the rise first of movies and then TV. Internet comes and you have this rise of bloggers, and suddenly you have individual created content, live journal, right, and other bloggers. Now you're seeing a swing all the way back. First, you saw the rise of YouTube and individual made content that professionalized. YouTube is more comparable now to contemporary TV. You then have the rise of visual driven culture like Instagram. And so even today, there was a post on one of the tea blogs about the majority of the content for tea ceremony being created today is really pretty visuals, but it's very surface oriented or surface detailed. And the two questions are, one, do you agree with that? And two, what do you think the effect of a visual driven culture, if it exists, is having on as an evolutionary pressure on the tea praxis?
I think it's a very good thing. I very distinctly remember back when I first started learning about really getting into tea in 2013, it was really hard to find any picture references of anything. If you wanted to see Wodui for the making of Shopuer, like good luck finding a photo, especially when you're Googling in English. But now you can go onto Instagram and look through some people's stories and see large batches of Wodui going. You can even get updated reports on how the fermentation's going. So the amount of visibility that it brings into is really good. And I think it's a great way to distinguish the various levels of technique that are being applied, especially on the production side. to move from a world of storytelling in a way of like, you go like to this ancient mountain and these ancient trees and like this really largely embellished type of marketing, to really seeing the grit and the grime that tea production actually is. It feels more honest. It feels like almost in a sense pulling back the veil when you get exposed to it so directly. The transition from something like Facebook, which you could highly curate your life, to what people are saying, like things like Snapchat or TikTok, where it's a little more honest, a little more raw.
Yeah, I've really liked the shift as well that you were mentioning, right? From marketing in the tea industry as storytelling to marketing as education. And I think we've mentioned this a little bit on previous podcasts, but the visual element has really helped to bring a lot of the marketing that used to exist into a format where it's now helpful to the consumers, or more helpful, in my opinion. Definitely agree with what you said, Ryan, where I remember trying to figure out what did show-puer processing look like back when I had first learned about it, like in 2010. And yeah, you could find nothing online. I do think, just like anything in life, there's good and bad to the shift in more visual medium for the way that tea ceremony is often represented. I would say the bad is kind of what Jason touched upon, where the visuals are quite pretty, but it's all quite surface level. So a lot of content that you see online, especially as far as like Instagram goes for tea, is really focused on these very nice visuals. But if you look at the text that's often associated with it, there's not much to learn there. And so it's all kind of just become, I would say, pretty picture contests. It's nice to know what other people are drinking, right? But you're not really sharing in that experience. You see a nice photo and that's all there is to it. So I think there's a few people who are doing a good job of trying to educate through the photos, whether that's educating about the ware itself or specific technique that utilizes a ware, but it's super few and far between. A lot of the Instagram scrolling that I think I do, it just ends up being looking at pretty pictures. So I would say that's kind of the downside, is people just trying to kind of show off wares with no educational content behind them.
On the merchant side, to some extent, I agree, but to a larger extent, I disagree, especially in the production side, where you really do get to see in the weeds. But when it comes to the brewing practitioners, I totally agree. It feels like a pretty picture contest. And even I've thought myself, what does good technique look like? And how do you convey that visually? Because it's a sensory experience, primarily through taste. And conveying that, even in writing, is difficult. And in pictures, it's even more difficult.
Yeah, I definitely like where you're going there. I think we've all seen like very, I would say, Beijing style, right? Like tea preparation, so more like the, not specifically Tenren, but like tea preparation to look pretty for the sake of looking pretty, not to make good tea. I just associate that with like, super expensive tea houses that are just trying to sell tea. But we've all seen that tea as an art as far as the preparation goes, but not actually to make good tea. And I think there is no way to convey through a visual medium proper or good technique, unless we're talking maybe like a narrative video or something like that. But if it's looking pretty for the sake of looking pretty, it's probably not. The focus is not brewing good tea. And so I don't know that a visual medium is ever going to be a way that we represent how good tea techniques are developed and a way to progress good tea technique.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to intuition, what is good tea technique? What does create a better brew? You have to live it. And until you've lived it, it's really hard to identify it because there's so much theater. So using it as a teaching tool, because I remember early in my educational days, there were some brewers that I really highly regarded, and there were videos of them brewing tea, but I had tea with them in the past, and I understood their technique, and a lot of it was explained to me, but I still wanted to learn more. So I remember watching like every last detail to try to pick up anything that could improve my technique. And I was almost going through in my mind, like commenting, okay, why did they do it that way? And then, thinking about it and working backwards. But there's not a whole lot of that content online where it's almost like commentary, like in golf or even in the World Barista Championship, where there's someone like talking over who is, has good technique and can deconstruct why everything is being done that way. And I remember that's one of the things that both you and Jason did when we would bring people over to Penn State. Afterwards, or sometimes even during the event, right, you would be breaking down very specifically and giving commentary about what was done and why.
I'm just going to try and break out my golf voice. I imagine like, all right, he's got his finger, his index finger pointing directly into the teapot from the Tetsubin. Look at the way he's pouring, very gentle, perfectly matches, this Dan Kong Oolong that he's brewing. All right. And I'm seeing that the hand is very steady as it holds the pot. I think there can be a sport made here of commentating Gong Fu, and maybe that goes back to satirizing it. But I definitely think we're all on the same page as far as this discussion goes. But it goes back to the crux of the chapter, right? The primacy of perception. So your own experience and this hands-on, experiential learning is what's most important when it comes to developing good technique. And I don't think this visual medium always lends itself to that hands-on firsthand experience.
That brings me to my next question. In this chapter, we discuss, or it builds up an argument that the evolution of praxis is Darwinian, that it is going through an evolutionary process, that it needs to change to remain alive. But in evolutionary theory, you're going to see random mutations and random changes, and not all of those random changes are positive. So you will have some advancement and some new progeny, or in our case, technique, will survive, and some will not have a good fitness function and will not survive. So my two sides of this question are: one, what is or what makes technique good or bad? How do you define good or bad technique? And the follow-up to that is, what does that mean for practitioners who are not experiencing the tea, that are not experiencing the results of the technique? If they're reading about this either in this book, which this book is very clear that it is it cannot alone teach anyone to brew better tea, or browsing through things on Instagram or reading on other blogs. How do they differentiate good and bad technique when they haven't had the sensory experience?
I think I could take that first part. What is good or bad technique? A good technique is the application, right, of some technique that has a positive effect, I would say, on the flavor of the tea, right? So the outcome. If your goal when you sit down to brew tea is to take your skill, the wares you have, and brew the best cup of tea possible with what you have available to you, then any technique you apply which improves or makes the tea better is a good technique. Any technique that you apply that makes the tea worse, right, whether that's just the aroma, the flavor, the mouthfeel, right, that final cup of tea, the outcome, the product, right, of your brewing, anything that makes it worse is going to be a bad technique. Now, just addressing the second part of that question, right, how do we showcase, right, to someone who may not understand, right, so maybe a beginner, right, someone who is trying to understand what is good or bad technique, how do you showcase to them through a visual medium what is good or what is bad when they haven't experienced the tea? Man, I'd love to leave that open to the the listeners, because I don't think I know off the top of my head. But if I was gonna take a guess at it, I do think something like what Ryan was saying, competitions or formats where there can be some common commentator or narration, where good technique, bad technique, right, can all be pointed out, and not in a way that's personal, right, just as a way to objectively show that for the people maybe who have tasted this tea, or people who were present, right, at the competition, and got to hear about how the outcome, the product, the tea, tasted. Some kind of narration that really breaks down why the decisions that the brewer made were good or bad, and why the techniques they used were good or bad, would be really helpful for beginners. Because I think if you're not able to taste it, then you need to hear from someone you trust why the techniques that were chosen were positive or negative, right?
So to address the first part of the question about random mutations, there's two things that go on, I think, both as you acquire skill and as you acquire preferences. The first is that you have to be taught what is good. And I want to dive into that a little bit. And then the second are your own personal preferences. Because if you ask the question, what is quality? What is good tea, right? There is a general consensus among good practitioners of an answer to that question. It might be tea specific. A good dansong has these characteristics. It's very fragrant. It's, the roast that it has isn't going to kill that fragrance, and there's a well agreed upon set. And same for yancha, maybe same for pu'er as well. But why is that good? Why is that good quality? Why is, what makes that different than other types when it comes to a flavor perspective? And when I really think through it, it's an agreement upon how other people at a similar level are going to have an experience with that tea. So let's just say for a moment, I hate dansong. I hate all dansong, but as someone who's had a lot of tea, I'd be able to recognize what a high quality dansong tastes like, even if it is not to my preferences. And what I'm really doing there is I'm guessing how other people who have had a lot of tea, to what extent they would agree that it is high quality. So it's this consensus of what is good tea that's been slowly building the status quo for hundreds, maybe even longer, of years throughout this praxis. So you have to have enough experiences with enough teas and enough people to have some intuitive sense of what good tea is. And then once you get there, you have the agency to change that, right? And to where your preferences lie, whether or not it's towards blends or single origin or different types of roasting styles, or and then, as enough of those people have preferences, can move that entire status quo. So like high mountain oolongs are a new thing. That profile is totally new to Gongfu Cha as of 30 years ago or 40 years ago. But those types of flavors and those type of techniques to produce that tea, have been adopted into what high level practitioners think of as good tea or could be good tea. And I think, along the way, you'll have some people that have some weird preferences. We'll call those the mutations. And if they're rejected by the top echelons of people that, are decide what quality is, then, those mutations kind of just fizzle out.
Yeah, I think another thing that fits along with that, when you first start learning, you really take in a lot of what you see around you, right? You're learning techniques that were developed maybe by the people who are teaching you, maybe by their teachers, so on and so forth. So a lot of these techniques, there's some purpose behind the way that they're done. They weren't developed in a vacuum. And, if you were to just take a couple sets of teaware and tea to an island, and you hadn't learned any of those techniques, and you just brewed tea for like 80 years on this island, right? I don't know where you're getting water, but you just brewed tea on this island for 80 years with a very basic understanding. It's likely, as we think of this as Darwinian, right? It's likely you would come up with really, really weird technique that is not likely to be generally accepted as good technique, because a lot of these practices, right, which specifically for, I think, kind of our modern Gongfu Cha, go back to the Qing dynasty, right? There's a lot of very specific movements, technique that all tie into each other, and there's a purpose and a reason behind them. I think a lot of the time when you're a newer brewer, you start to try and infuse your own preferences into your brewing practice. And they don't, your preferences or what you kind of want to do with the tea doesn't always fit with some of these techniques that were developed over the course of, decades for a purpose of brewing better tea. And so I know when I was first starting to brew, there's a lot of things that I tried out. Not all of it yielded good cups of tea. And I think Jason probably shot down a lot of what I was trying, because he was just like, man, what are you doing? Like, that is not how you brew tea. Because when you're young, I think you just want to try and suffuse something with your personality, your flavor, right, and your preference. I think as you brew tea more and as you learn from teachers, you start to learn that you don't have any place really infusing your own technique into the practice until you've really truly mastered the basics. And then I think even from there, practice the basics for a long time. I think that's when we can start to really try and bring those mutations in, right? So maybe technique that comes from your personality, from your mind, right? That you over time have decided brews a better cup of tea. That's when you can start to show those to the general practitioner base, see people's takes on that, take the feedback, try and improve your technique with that. But when we see these techniques that just come about, right, from newbies or that were developed like totally in isolation with any actual practice, those are almost always, I feel like, rejected on the spot, and they yield very strange cups of tea very frequently. So I think there's a lot of the tradition of the practice shapes what technique can arise. And just going back to the Darwinian mention, it's not in a vacuum. We're not on an island developing this practice. So we're always within this culture that, kind of shapes and surrounds the technique.
What is an example for both good and bad technique that have arisen recently?
So I'd say this is obviously subjective, but I believe it's been coined the warrior style on Instagram. But it's taking basically any tea, whatever it is, doesn't matter the type of tea, and it's doing 10 grams for 100 milliliter gaiwan. And so I've seen people just doing green teas, 10 grams in 100 milliliter gaiwan, regardless of the style of tea, and just hitting it super hard. And I think some teas, certainly there's a place for that, right? Trying to create a really strong, dense, intense brew. But just for some teas, it's like, why would you do that to a Tenchong Huilong Zhai or something like that? Like, it's not going to be good. It can't be good, right? But maybe they enjoy it, right? This person has over time developed a preference for super astringent or super bitter or just insanely strong tea. But that's something I've seen come up, not from one individual, but from a lot of people, where regardless of style of tea, they're using a really high gram to milliliter ratio. And I don't think that brews out a good cup of tea in every single scenario.
One recent-ish one is that silver is becoming more and more accessible. When I first started doing tea, it was very rare to see a silver teapot, but now they're becoming much, much more common. And having consumed tea out of a lot of silver teapots, I think it is definitely a positive progression.
I think I want to tackle onto that I don't think it always is, though. I think the prevalence of silverware is a great thing, but I think a lot of people are using it for teas that it does not fit, in my opinion. And so I think the application of silver fits into both good and bad technique, depending on who's using it and why.
It's a great point. Probably not so great for roasted tea.
How different is our development and exploration here in the Western world than it is in China?
I feel like we need Zongjun on to add a little flavor to this one. But all of us, right? Although we've traveled extensively through Asia, and we've been to Taiwan, China, Korea, Japan, right, et cetera, to study tea, to go to tea farms, to be with tea teachers, masters, et cetera. We still, by large in part, are really encultured by the Western tea drinking world. And so I think a lot of what we think of as good technique, and a lot of the preferences we've adapted are largely formed by being part of the Western tea drinking community. So I think maybe we need to wait for Zongjun on that one, unless Ryan or Jason, if either of you have opinions on that.
Yeah, the majority of my tea experiences in China, in mainland China, have been very commercially driven. Even if I knew the merchant, they were a tea merchant. Even if, it was not like a sales environment. There were definitely people that made their income through tea. So I have, it's something I have yet to experience in a non-commercial setting, in any significant way with a high-level practitioner. I mean, I have had tea at people's houses and things like that, but not any serious learning outside of commercial settings or pseudo-commercial settings. I don't know about you, Jason.
I've had tea with individuals in mainland China outside of a commercial setting, but I would not characterize them as super high-level practitioners, people who are interested and enjoyed tea.
I mean, I think that's interesting. Why have the majority of your formative educational experiences been commercial? And to what degree does that go on in China in a non-commercial way? Not for foreigners, but for local people.
Yeah, I think it's a little difficult whether to characterize my very early introduction to tea as commercial or not. Those individuals were in the industry, but they were most definitely not trying to sell me anything. At that time, I did not know enough about tea for them to talk me into buying anything crazy. Instead, they were very interested in seeing predominantly my tasting ability. Right? They didn't assume that I would know anything about tea. And so they would give me samples and say, which of these do you think is better? Which one of these do you think is, spring or winter? Or sometimes they'd give me an example first. This is a winter tea versus a spring tea. Where do you think these two or this one sample is from? And doing that for, hours and hours over days. And, I think in some ways that was an education I could not have paid for. I was in the right place at the right time, and I got very lucky. On the other hand, maybe they're just very good at cultivating future buyers. I have quite a bit of that producer's tea in my collection. I continue to very much enjoy their tea. I continue to think that their tea is expensive, but very good. So, how much did those initial formative experiences leave an impact on my preferences, which caused me to still have a high preference for those teas even after, decades of trying other teas? That's a question that's very hard to answer, and whether it was commercially or motivated or not is I think impossible for me to answer. Outside of those scenarios, right, I had tea with friends in China who lived in China or who found out that I was interested in tea, and so they would pull out some tea, or when we visited their parents, they'd pull out some, random Yixing tub or plastic tub filled with a couple pu'er cakes, say we would drink tea. I think, okay, right, not the world's highest level practitioners. Sometimes their parents, right, did enjoy tea. I was in Kunming. There was people buying lots and lots of tea in 2007. Some of it good. So, it's I would say that the exploration that I've seen in China is more about individuals exploring different styles of tea, different classes of tea that are not from their area. Individuals in Yunnan drinking oolongs and potentially Taiwanese tea. There's always been a trade, right? Yunnan greens and Sichuan greens. That's pretty normal. But people in Yunnan who are mostly focused on pu'er are now trying post-fermentation teas from other regions as well. Luan, Lubao, golden flower teas, right? I think that that's pretty interesting. As for super high level practitioners innovating on brewing technique, I've not personally seen that.
I definitely, as far as being in China, my experiences in tea settings were highly commercial, hyper commercial in China. Although I would say in Taiwan and Korea, Jason, you and I together got to experience very non-commercially motivated tea education, which really helped, I think, form the basis of a lot of my understanding and future progression in tea.
It also widely influenced us to use Korean wood-fired ceramics in Chinese tea, which is an unusual thing that some individuals from the former institute and you and I continue to do.
Yeah, you don't see it too much, I would say, on the rest of the blogosphere, save like one or two bloggers. But I think, Korean wares, talking about it specifically, and Korean tea, I'm hoping those will get more popular as we move into the future. There's a reason that we use them. We think that the Korean wood-fired wares can add really interesting elements to your tea. And specifically, Jason, we had tea recently, me and Ryan. And man, I want an ongi water aging jar bad after having tea with you the last time. So certainly from a wares perspective, I think there's some interesting progression that's still going to go on within our Chinese tea ceremony practice, incorporating still further wares from other countries to help improve the flavor of your tea and improve your technique. So I think we're still in a really nice evolutionary phase as far as using other wares that are non-Chinese goes.
While we're talking about wares, what is your opinion on Wensheng Bei? I'm going to ask each of you this question.
Yeah, Ryan, you brought it up earlier, and I think I wanted to talk about this more as well. We were all taught, and Ryan, actually, I'm not sure if by the time you came to the Institute, we were still using them heavily, but when I was first learning how to brew, Wensheng Beis were always on my tea tray. Was heavily using bamboo and wood tea trays back when I first learned. And I don't think I ever brewed without one until maybe 6 or 8 months into brewing tea every single day for hours. I really do enjoy them for high mountain oolongs and occasionally green tea. I still use them when I was in the Institute. Up until about 2014. When I left Penn State and started continuing my tea practice on my own, I never purchased a Wensheng Bei. So now I just primarily enjoy the smell of the cold cup after you drink your tea, but haven't used a Wensheng Bei in probably 7 years and don't really plan on going back unless someone hands me one when I'm in Taiwan.
Yeah, I don't like them. I think they're nonsense. I think it's one more surface area for aromatics to cling to, kind of diluting the cup when you drink it. And, they stay hot for a really long time. And I actually found that porcelain, once it cools down a little bit and some of that water is evaporated, where you really get the aroma delivery when you go back to smell the cup, and just don't really see the point of it. However, as a tool, back at the Institute, something that I used to do, and I actually can't think of a better piece of teaware to do this with, is when you use the inverted method for a Wensheng Bei, you can put one tea leaf or one ball of like a Taiwanese oolong in it, and you can taste in leaf or intra tea variability between different leaves that you put in. If they're approximately the same size, you should have the same water to tea ratio. And then you do the inverted method, you allow it to brew for like 5 minutes, and you can taste the different cups, which I thought was a pretty fun educational tool. But other than that, I think that they're nonsense.
That's an awesome idea, Ryan. That must have been after my time because I've never done that. And now I'm thinking about going out and getting some Wensheng Beis just to try that. But I think all of us subscribe to using the least amount of surface areas possible. So for people listening on the podcast, we're non-Gangdao Bei users, which also usually lends us to not wanting to use anything else other than the cups, right? We go right from gaiwan or teapot to cup. That's what we believe yields the best cup of tea. And so Jason, I have a feeling your answer on Wensheng Beis is probably similar, right? Because you also are not trying to hit 3 or 4 different surfaces before you drink the tea.
The vast majority of the time, I do not use Wensheng Bei. I will say, though, that the surface material itself makes a huge difference. And I have some very high-end Wensheng Beis that I got from a wood-fired kiln in Yingge, the last, I think, kiln that's still wood-firing. And when evaluating new fresh harvest Taiwanese high mountain oolong samples, I will sometimes use a Wenshengbi on the first or second brew and greatly enjoy the aroma. I do think it removes a little bit from the cup, but on making purchasing decisions, I do very rarely find it helpful.
And I think this probably applies to everything we say on the podcast, but totally our opinions. If you're listening, go out and try it yourself, right? Go use a Wenshengbi, use it the way Ryan said, because I think that's awesome and I want to try that. Use it the way you've been using it. Try not using it, see what's the difference, and decide for yourself.
But if you buy a $2 Wenshengbi that's ceramic on the inside and yixing on the outside, and you come back and you say Wenshengbi suck, that's an opinion formed partially by material. The material of the Wenshengbi most obviously makes a huge impact in both its ability to retain aromatics, its heat retention, its effect on the tea. So I do think that there's a mix of things going on. I think that Wenshengbi's are inappropriate in many contexts, and that the tea world went through a slight obsession with them, and that has tapered off, and now most people are not using them. I also think some of the criticism is because the majority of individuals are using very poor quality material Wenshengbi's, which are readily available.
And I think that opinion can spread out to all teaware, right? So whatever you use, if it's low quality, it will probably have a bad impact on the tea. And if you take the time to search for higher quality materials, which if you're a tea lover is probably what you're doing all the time anyway, you should always, before deciding that something doesn't fit in your practice, see if there's an option for a higher quality material available and try that. And then if still it doesn't yield the results you like, take it out of your practice.
Upon thinking about this a little more, actually, I do think there's one that they do have some merit for people who don't know anything about Chinese tea ceremony, because it adds in the smelling component as something very intentional, right? Not when you drink tea with a new person, almost no one will go back to the empty cup and think that it's a good idea to smell it. That's something that you pick up along the way. But having a specific vessel to do that kind of forces the drinker to go through that experience. And I think it's better to have that experience than to have no experience smelling the tea that way, or what's left over in the cup for that type of aroma. So in terms of an approachability standpoint, I think that it's better than not smelling the empty cup.
And there is a tiny bit of ritualization too when you're doing the inverted method, right? Especially as someone new to tea ceremony or someone who's never drank high quality Chinese tea before. When you see someone pour tea into a Wenshengbi, put the cup on top, and then either give it to you or flip it themselves, right? But if they give it to you and you have to flip it, there's something that really draws you in, I think, to the whole process, the ceremony. If you're just handed a cup of tea, it's not really quite the same. When you get to have some action on the tea, I think you feel even more involved in the whole process. So I would say, as we kind of bring all these points up, for newbies, it's really a great tool. And maybe as you go forward, you can decide to take it out of your practice. But I think it is really helpful when you're first learning about tea or first even just drinking tea.
Yeah, it helps bring the sensory experience front and center. It reminds me of going into Teavana retail stores, and they open the big tin and they use the lid to waft the tea at you. It's like similar in let's say you're in Taiwan, you're drinking tea, you have to pull that cup up so you're participating, and then you're also smelling it, and you're an active participant and being blasted with sensory experiences.
I think we have time for just one more question. Where will this chapter generate contention or debate in the tea world?
So I would say there's two places where I feel like this chapter will generate debate. The first would be in the little 2x2 that you have as far as good, bad technique, common, rare technique. I don't think everyone's going to agree with everything in there. And I think that's personal. Ryan and I, your whole editorial team is totally behind what you've put in here. But there are people that are going to definitely come back and say that they don't think rinsing tea is a bad technique, because I think that's probably 75% of the Western tea brewing world that is rinsing their tea, and actually a really large percentage of the Eastern, right? I would say Chinese brewers, by and large, when I've been in China and been drinking tea with people, all rinse their tea. And, we talked about it a little before already. I'm not going to go into why it's good or bad, but I think you'll have people that might argue, right, that liu gen or rinsing are not bad technique. And you're not saying they're always bad in this chapter, but I think people will debate that. Additionally, just the last paragraph, you kind of have a call to action in where you state that, Chinese tea is a living art. To keep it a living art, you have to continually change things, right? And the better changes hopefully will take place and evolve it in a positive direction. I think we're all well aware that there's still people that don't think of Chinese tea ceremony as a living art. And so I think that's going to be the crux of debate for some individuals. But obviously we don't agree with that. I believe it's a living art. And as we currently live in this developing art, and we see things change even over the course of just years, we'll continue to, of course, propagate the idea that it's a living art and that it needs to change and modernize in positive ways. But I think you're going to see some debate on that point.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us in this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for a discussion of the next chapter, Aesthetic Experience and Aesthetic Context.